This is the Multifaith Matters podcast. I'm your host, John Morehead. Well, this is the podcast for Multifaith Matters, and I'm privileged today to have a returning guest, George Chryssides. George, welcome back.
Thank you.
Let me read a little bit.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's great to have you back here. A little bit of George's bio from the back of the book that we're going to be discussing today. He is Research Fellow in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at York St. John University in the UK. His publications include Jehovah's Witnesses, and the Bloomsbury Companion to Studying Christians. And today we're going to be talking about a new book for those watching. Whoop, I guess you can't see it. It's hard. We'll give him my screen. And there we go. He's got it held up. It's Contested Concepts in the Study of Religion, a Critical Exploration, which he co-edited with Amy R. Whitehead. And it's a fantastic book. And I'm really looking forward to discussing the contents here because this is a topic that is known by scholars who study religion, but not by the average person who assumes that there's pretty much a consensus on a lot of these ideas. But to dive in, what was the idea? How did this book come about, the idea for it?
Well, the idea was, it was when we were on a field trip at the end of a conference back in 2019. We were taken to what looked like a Roman Catholic monastery. And I think the people that worked there originally were Roman Catholics, but were kind of elbowed out of the Roman Catholic tradition. And the principal of the monastery called himself Swami Roberto, which doesn't sound very Roman Catholic, as you'd agree. But when you looked around the monastery, the Virgin Mary was holding a lotus flower in an image, and there was a Zen garden at the back, and there were various symbols with the Om message. So when Swami Roberto talked to us, one of the things he said was, "We're not syncretistic." So some of us thought that's a bit puzzling because it looked as if there was a whole merging of traditions. So I was sitting next to Carol Cusack, who's an Australian scholar, and I said to her, "That's a bit strange." And she said that she agreed, but she also said, "Well, I've got problems with the term syncretism anyway." And I said, "Well, so have I, because syncretism implies that you've got a pure tradition that gets mixed up with another pure tradition. And historically, religions are never pure. They're always a kind of mix of what textbooks call traditional religions, but aren't, of course, as separate as the textbooks say." So we talked a bit about syncretism, and then we said, well, there are other concepts too that are problematic, and we listed about half a dozen in our conversation. By the time we got to the end of the day, I had written down, I think, 24. And when we got back home, the list expanded to about 50. Now, the original idea was that Carol and I would do the book. But Carol had various issues and commitments and said that she couldn't do it. So we approached Amy Whitehead, who is not in Australia, but in New Zealand, which is not actually all that close, but it's in the same hemisphere anyway. And I've known Amy for a number of years and had a very high regard for her as a scholar. So we approached Amy, and I think maybe we thought at one point that the three of us would do the book together. But Carol dropped out, and Amy and I worked together on it. Carol offered some advice, because one of the things we did initially was, because we had 50 concepts, we couldn't have 50 chapters in a book of that length. So whenever I write a book, actually, the first thing I do is to get out my pocket calculator and then work out just how many words you've got for each chapter. So if we had too many concepts, we'd have too short chapters. And if we had too few concepts allowing greater length, then that wouldn't be terribly satisfactory. So somewhere in the middle, you split the difference. And we decided that about 2,500 words each was enough for people to develop the idea and to give it a proper discussion. So that was what we did, and we ended up with, I can't remember how many chapters now. No, I never remember what I've written, to be honest. Yes, it was 25 chapters in all. So that covered a sufficient range of topics, we thought, but at the same time gave the authors enough space to just explore the idea that we had assigned to them.
Now, when folks hear about the book, they might assume that this is a keywords book or maybe a dictionary of contested religious concepts. But in your introduction, you point out that's not what this book is about.
No, absolutely not. No, and as you know, when you send in a book proposal, it goes to a number of referees, and referees either make encouraging or disparaging comments. And actually, all four referees said the book was worth publishing. So that's an achievement, because usually there's some miserable person that says, on no account, publish this book. So we did get a thumbs up from all four. But one of them said, because one of the questions that Bloomsbury asked was, how would you describe this book in just a phrase? This person had written another keywords book. So we thought, well, no, that's not what we're on about at all. A keywords book is for people that are new to a subject and actually don't understand the concepts. So maybe a raw student would fail to know what eschatology means. So they need a keywords book or a dictionary or whatever for that. That wasn't what we were doing. What we were doing is to say there are concepts like syncretism that are inherently problematic, not because you don't understand what the word means, but because maybe you don't see the problems inherent in the concept, namely that somebody who's accused of syncretism isn't stirring two religions together and getting a kind of amalgam of the two. It's not like that. And we need to be careful about using the term. So it was Carol Cusack that got landed with the concept of syncretism, because really she had started it all off. So that was what we did with the various concepts. And given that referee's comment, we were careful to say at the beginning, this is not a keywords book we're doing. It is a discussion of problems that we call contested concepts. But contested can mean a variety of things. It can mean that scholars disagree about what the concept means. It could be that we're using it without sufficient reflection, because with a concept like world religion, which gets used very frequently still, it's not quite clear what people mean by that. You know, when you say something's a world religion, why is Sikhism a world religion? Because it tends to home in on a particular part of the globe. Why is Judaism a world religion? It's not proselytizing. Jainism, Zoroastrianism are very small in number, so they're not world religions, if you're going to use that term, because of their size. So it raises the question, what on earth do we mean when we talk about world religion? And we're not necessarily talking about age either, because the Baha'is, who are relative newcomers to the so-called world religion scene, are saying, we're a world religion. So what are we talking about? And I think with that particular expression, our recommendation was don't use that concept. It's meaningless. Um, so there are some where you would say the concept really is inherently problematic and we should be rethinking our use of it. In other cases, we should maybe be thinking that we need to be a bit clearer about what we mean, or perhaps we recognize that there are just different definitions, as is the case with a term perhaps like religion.
Now, this kind of feeds off of what you just said there. Scholars are going to be familiar with the idea that there are these contested concepts, but I think the average individual who uses the terms that you describe in the book and other terms that aren't discussed makes the assumption that these are pretty much settled concepts. Everybody understands what they mean.
Yeah.
Why do you think it is that scholars do contest a lot of these concepts? Why the wide disagreement?
I think one of the things we're saying is that they don't contest them enough.
Hmm.
I think that was the point, because these expressions all get used by scholars, but I guess they get contested because I mean, sometimes people have different axes to grind with a term like religion. Now, my own opinion is that there are scholars in religion that themselves are not particularly religious. Some of them are actually quite opposed to religion. And I mean, that's okay, because if you're a criminologist, you're opposed to crime. So you can be opposed to the subject matter that you're specializing in. But some scholars that I would regard as being a bit hostile to religion will say to their new students, there is no such thing as religion. And then if you're a fresh student, you think, well, that's a bit strange. Isn't that what I've come to study here? So you can get this kind of idea that religion is such a nebulous term that we shouldn't be using it at all. That's one point of view. There's another point of view which I think would be my own, namely that it's an expression that is used in common currency. We all know it when we see it. And it was Ludwig Wittgenstein, whom I studied in my philosophy days, who said the meaning of a word is its use in language. So my view would be, let's look at how people are using the term, and then maybe we can get at the meaning that way. The author who wrote about religion, which I think was, I'm forgetting my own book now. It was David Morgan that wrote about religion. He took a somewhat different approach to the topic, and that's fair enough. Religion is contested in that sort of sense that a lot of us have quite different views about how we should define the term, whether we should be using it at all, uh, whether there is a case for saying that we study certain things that are popularly called religions, or whether we should expand out into things like Marxism and secularism and patriotism, all sorts of isms. Why do we put them outside the religious category? So there is also a view in the study of religion that we should be talking about worldview studies, not about religious studies. So again, a variety of opinions here, and well, I guess I could say what I think, but there's such a huge variety of disagreements about the topic.
Would some of the disagreement come also by way of special academic specialization? So, a religious studies perspective on these contested concepts might come from one vantage point, but someone who, for example, is an anthropologist looking at religious expression in a given culture might see that it's more difficult to make the separation between religion and culture. They're more united. So, does the academic lens that one is looking at, is that a factor?
Well, I think that is a factor, that it's very hard to separate what's religion and what's culture, because if one takes things like, trying to think of an example, probably not a good example, about Sikhs wearing turbans, is that part of their culture, or is that part of their religion? Because not all Sikhs do. And again, I think we can often be guilty of stereotyping. A lot of textbooks will talk about the 5 Ks of Sikhism. Well, I think most Sikhs I come across don't actually score 5 out of 5 on that one. Um, but yeah, it's very hard to say what is part of a religion and what's part of culture. Maybe a better example would be polygamy, because Christian missionaries have had problems about that. They've gone out to countries where polygamy is maybe not exactly the norm, but it's fairly widespread. Now, is that part of their culture or part of their religion? And is it part of Christianity to say you mustn't be polygamously married? Because if you do, and if you're a missionary, then you're saying you must choose which of your several wives you're going to have. And I mean, that's problematic as well, because all of your wives except one aren't going to be very happy about that one. So, but you could say, well, this is part of their culture. I mean, after all, there are quite a lot of polygamists in the Bible. So arguably that's something that might be acceptable. So the point I'm making is not to adjudicate on that one, but to say, well, what's religion, what's culture? Can you separate the two? And it's not a clear distinction at all.
Let's talk about a couple of the concepts that are discussed in the book, and these two are separate entries, but I'm going to ask you to comment on them together. That are near and dear to my heart, the term cult and the term new religious movement. We see the term cult constantly in the media. I think most recently there was a religious group, I can't remember what country it was in, where the pastor supposedly through his leadership is now responsible for the starvation deaths of many of his parishioners. And they're saying, well, the media says that's a cult. And the assumption is everybody understands what a cult is. And yet in the academic world, there is great hesitancy and reservation to use that term, and they substitute new religious movement. Can you talk about the term cult and the term new religious movement and why those are contested concepts?
Okay, well, the thing about cult, actually, to talk about cult takes me right back to when I started my work on new religious movements. Because my first experience of looking at cults was when I was on the United Reformed Church's Mission and Other Faiths Committee. That was back in 1981. I joined them, and they were looking at relationships with other faiths. And the issue of new religions or cults was raised. The question was, can we relate to them in a similar sort of way as we do with Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims and so on, or are they different? And we invited one of the representatives of what's often called an anti-cult organization, and she came to speak to us, and she brought a list, and the list was entitled List of Cults, Sects and Fringe Groups. And this was quite an extraordinary list. It had 107 entries in all. I counted them, and they included the most extraordinary range of things. I don't have it right in front of me, so I'm relying on memory. But as a for instance, Baha'i were there. Now they didn't include spiritualists. That seemed a bit strange. They had biorhythms. They had Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, of course, and there was this extraordinary mix of religious organizations and sort of psycho-healing techniques, crystal therapy, just about everything was put in this mix with a number of omissions. And did they forget the omitted ones, or did they not think they were cult, sects and fringe groups, or what? So the whole thing seemed to me to be a muddle. And actually, I wasn't the only member of the committee that reacted badly to this presentation. We said, well, this is just an assortment of techniques and forms of spirituality, whatever. So that's part of the problem with the word cult. First of all, it's pejorative. If I say you're in a cult, I'm saying that's terrible. In fact, a number of people in the anti-cult movement talk about a destructive cult. And I'm never quite clear what they mean about that. Are they contrasting it maybe with benign cults? Because we never hear about them if they exist. And if they're destructive cults, what exactly do they destroy? yeah, maybe they've got an answer to that. I'm not saying they don't, but it's puzzling. And not only is it pejorative, but as with this 107 concept list I mentioned, what do you put into it and what don't you? Now, my colleague Stephen Sutcliffe makes a comment in a book he wrote about the New Age. It's called Children of the New Age, and it was published in, I think it was 2002. And his objection to the term is, as he puts it, it lacks predictable content. And that's something that has always struck me and stayed with me. That's a very good criterion to use when deciding whether a term is a useful one. Because if we talked about tables and chairs, they've got predictable content. You and I trust, don't have any difficulty in saying that's a table, that's a chair, and so on. But when we talk about, well, in Stephen's case, it's what is New Age, when is something part of the New Age and when it's not, it's kind of nebulous. So actually, we use that concept in the book as one of the chapters, but also with the word cult. What's a cult? When is something a cult? Is spiritualism a cult? Is the Hare Krishna movement a cult? If you try telling Scientologists that they're a cult, they'll get their lawyers on the job pretty fast. So, on the other hand, it is okay, I think, to talk about the cult of Elvis, or we talk about cult films and cult books. So the whole thing is just so nebulous that it's a concept that I personally, and probably the majority of my colleagues, would say that's a term to be avoided. It's pejorative and it hasn't got predictable content.
But so academics would substitute the term new religious movement, which is not pejorative, but even that has its problems, its challenges in terms of a label.
Yeah, well, I think part of the problem is that the media landed us with this kind of web of concepts that don't fit together, like the 107-point list. And they said, these are cults. And we've said as academics, well, we don't like that term, so what term can we substitute? And I'm not sure we've done the right thing actually on that, because as I say in my chapter, I really think new religious movements is a concept that we're now landed with. We can't do much about it now that it's stuck. But I've got problems with it, and I'm not sure that I can do better, really. But given that the media have got this list of concepts and movements and whatever, and said these are cults, then we've had the task of saying, well, what have they got in common? What is it that makes us interested in them as new religious movements? Now, and if you want my own solution to it, I think it might be better to talk about things like 19th century Christian-derived organizations, and actually to label the date rather than to say they're new. Because actually, the ones that were new when I started work on new religious movements are kind of getting old.
Mm-hmm.
So new is relative. Are they religious? Well, I don't think biorhythms are, if you're going to include them in the list, or tarot cards or whatever. Are they movements? Well, as I say in the chapter, they're not actually movements, they're well-defined organizations. So the term new religious movements does have the advantage of not being pejorative. If I say that something is a new religious movement, then I'm simply saying, well, it's religious, not happy with movement, but it's new-ish. It came into being as an organization maybe in the last 200 years. It's not all that new, but it's not all that old either.
Right, right. Yeah. Well, in addition to these various chapters that discuss these contested concepts, you end the book with a chapter written by yourself and your co-editor, Concepts in Practice. What is that chapter trying to do?
Well, that chapter is trying to fill a gap for a start at a practical level. When you do an anthology, more often than not, you get an author that doesn't deliver. So to be frank, we were a chapter short because somebody defaulted on us. So Amy and I thought, what do we do about that? And we thought, well, why not have a chapter that is a kind of case study that causes us to decide whether some of the concepts we've been discussing are applicable and how they fit in and so on. So um, I suggested an incident at an interfaith. No, it wasn't an interfaith gathering. It was a Buddhist gathering. It was in Wolverhampton Town Hall a good few years ago now, and there was a Buddhist monk who, well, there were several Buddhist monks at the gathering. It was a celebration of Wesak, which is the day on which the Buddha is said to have been born, enlightened, and attained parinirvana, death after enlightenment. So it's a big cause for celebration. So I was at this event, and it was a kind of party. There were women and girls that had made tea and cakes and performed dances, and one or two people from the Buddhist community, and also people from the town hall and various dignitaries got up and made speeches. And then this Buddhist monk got up, and he was a Western convert. And if you're a convert, you're always more enthusiastic than people that have belonged to the religion all their lives. He got up on the platform and he said something to the effect that it was all very well to have tea and cakes and dancing, but this won't help you to gain enlightenment. You should be meditating. You should be taking part in the spiritual life of Buddhism. Now, that seemed to me, first of all, to be very rude, um, but also it indicated something that Westerners are interested in when they convert. They want to kind of get to the top spiritually. They want to meditate. They want to, well, maybe not attain nirvana, but they often talk about spiritual progress. Now, in my book, that's not what people necessarily join a religion for. You can get all sorts of things out of a religion, like tea and cakes, or maybe moral encouragement, counseling. There are all sorts of these, all sorts of things, perhaps building up to, if you're a Protestant, salvation. A lot of Protestants would say, well, we hit the jackpot on that, we're saved. So, yeah, the anyway, the incident that I suggested gave all sorts of scope to talk about things like conversion. Is it syncretism? Uh, I think there is blending of Eastern attitudes to Buddhism with Western concepts of what Buddhism is, which is very much kind of book-based and Nibbanic, as one author uses the term. You want to take a religion as you think seriously if you convert to it. So there was this host of concepts that we felt impinged on that particular incident. And so we tried to focus the book down on something that people could envisage and think about.
I'm assuming the audience for this book is primarily for scholars, trying to help them get them thinking. Is that the case? And if so, do you hope it also as a wider audience, more general readership?
Well, I'd hope there's a more general readership. When you put forward a book proposal, as I'm sure you know, publishers don't like you saying this will appeal to the general reader, because
Right.
that seems to be unduly optimistic. And it would be nice to think that everybody's rushing into their local public library demanding copies of the book. But I think we're realistic. People often think you make a vast fortune out of writing books. The builder that we employ comes round to our place and he sees some of the stuff that I've written. He says, "You must be rolling in it." And I've got to persuade him that I'm not Dan Brown. I haven't written the Da Vinci Code. That more often than not, you get a note from your publisher saying you haven't reached the target amount to transfer to your bank. So,
Right.
um, no, I've lost track of my train of thought there. What was it you asked me a moment
Oh,
ago?
you're the audience for the book.
The audience for the book, right? So the idea of the book was to kind of raise some kind of awareness and reflection among academics primarily, also to help students to recognize that when you use a concept, you're often in the middle of a host of problems about it. Concepts aren't straightforward. So that was the primary couple of aims, academic debate, helping students. But there may well be, and we hope there will be other people that are interested in the book because I like to think I write in a way that people can understand. When people tell me that I write clearly, then I feel complimented by that. Because maybe you've sat through lectures given by colleagues where you literally haven't understood a word of it. I'll be honest and say that. I mean, towards the end of my career now, I think it's quite safe to admit these things. But I don't think it's okay to wrap up your writing in obscure jargon that only a small elite can understand. We ought to be communicating better than we are. And that's what I hope we've managed to do. I think some chapters are a bit clearer than others in the book, but we've tried to get it across as clearly as possible.
Well, I think it's a great book. I'll be writing a review of it for Cultural Encounters Journal. And I'll let you know when that is published and available. And I want to direct folks to the program notes for this episode for not only a link to what you're doing, your information, but also the book itself, your co-editor, and there will be a link there to a discussion of the contributors at the book launch that you had. So there's far more that people can access to learn more about this book. And George, I just want to thank you for coming back again on the program.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for mentioning the link. You can actually see some of the authors in person if you follow that link. So I always used to wonder what scholars looked like in the days when I was a student, because you didn't have these kind of visuals. So you could actually put a face to the author if you look at the launch video.
Yeah, and folks can also, there'll be a link in the program notes to our prior conversation that we had in your work on Jehovah's Witnesses, which is one of the most watched videos of this podcast. So there's plenty there to follow up with. George, thank you again for coming on.
Well, thanks a lot.